Chapter 6. Dylan helped his grandfather load the small boat with tackle boxes and fishing poles. It was hard work. The boat was tippy and even in the shallow water, and it made it even harder by the large orange life preserver he had to wear. It was too big for him, with the collar coming up around his face and ears and the belt cinched too tight around his waist. He felt like he was wearing some kind of armor. It made him sweat where it touched his skin, and even though it was overcast and not particularly hot outside, he was boiling. They loaded the gear, and Dylan settled into the seat at the front of the small boat, which was very much like a canoe, but flat at the back with a small electric motor mounted to it. With an awkward one-leg shove, Grandpa pushed the boat away from the shore and took his seat in the back, rocking the boat. He lowered the small motor and turned the canoe toward the middle of the small lake. Dylan had, of course, been fishing before with his grandpa, but never alone. His dad had always been with him, and those times the two older men talked while he was alone at the front, holding his pole, staring blankly at the surface of the unmoving water. This time, there were only the two of them, and his grandpa started talking right away. "Did I ever tell you about how I learned how to fish?" He told Dylan the story of tying a string to a long limb he pulled from a downed tree and fashioned a hook out of a bottle top. He used to dig up worms after it rained and keep them in an old coffee can, and the trout would gobble these worms like they were popcorn in a movie theater. Dylan didn't mind these kinds of stories because they were probably, if nothing else, true. His grandpa told him more stories as they motored out to the center of the lake, and he prepared the poles with shiny lures and leeches. He put a bobber on Dylan's line so that he'd be able to tell when a fish was taking the bait. "I entered a fishing contest when I was about your age. First prize was $50 in a brand new tackle box. I caught the biggest fish I'd ever seen and only managed to come in second. We found out after the fact that the kid who won that tackle box had cheated. He'd bought a salmon from the fish house and hooked it to his line when no one was looking. I brought in a 2-pound bass and he landed a 30-pound salmon. When they sent the fish off to be cleaned, the monger could tell pretty quickly that something was fishy because my fish was still alive and this boy's had been dead for at least 3 days. But the boy, a vacationer, had already taken his prize and disappeared. I never did get that tackle box." Dylan chuckled. Well, he liked facts. He also liked wordplay, and his grandfather describing the situation as fishy was funnier to him than it probably should have been. For the first hour, his grandfather mostly watched. He taught Dylan how to open the gate on the reel, how to bring his arm back just so and flip the pole forward, pointing to where he wanted the lure and leech to land. After a few minutes of quiet waiting, he'd tell Dylan to reel his line back in and check the bait, which was more often than not still intact and hanging limp from the hook. He'd cast again and was getting pretty good at it, but every few casts, Grandpa would change the leech on his hook because, quote, "it looked too dead even for a fish." Eventually, Grandpa started to fish too, and it only took a couple of tries for him to start catching fish. Dylan noticed how smooth he was, how he never panicked. This observation became especially impressive when, after almost 2 hours and a dozen abandoned leeches, Dylan cast his line toward a tree that had fallen near the shore. Almost as soon as the lure hit the surface, his bobber began trembling and shaking. "Pull up, his Grandpa said. "You gotta set the hook. You've got one." Dylan did as he was told and had been shown. He knew he was supposed to give the pole a tug upward, but he got a little too excited. That little tug ended up being a full-scale yank, pulling his line, bobber, lure, hook, leech, and a sunfish the diameter of a grapefruit completely out of the water. The line tangled around Dylan's pole, but the weight of the fish and the lure at the end of the line, high up in the air, but the weight of the fish and the lure sent the end of the line high into the air in a long arc up, over, and behind him. The fish flapped wildly in the air as it followed its arcing path, and Dylan saw it separate from the hook just as it crossed over his head. The canoe rocked deeply as he shifted his weight back, and he nearly fell out backwards on the other side. He caught himself just in time to look up and see the sunfish belly smack on the surface, and steadied himself as the stunned fish laid still on its side for a second or two before flipping its tail and diving fast back down into the water. "Well, that's one way to catch him," Grandpa said with a laugh. But Dylan didn't laugh. He was tangled in his own fishing line and embarrassed for his overreaction to the fish on that line. "We got to get you unraveled. Just sit tight." Grandpa lowered the small motor and steered the boat toward a small island on the opposite side of the lake from where they had launched. They had drifted in that direction for a couple of hours, so it was closer to go there than back to the launch site. Dylan sat still and tried not to make the tangle any worse. When they neared the island, Grandpa raised the motor and stepped out of the canoe into shin-deep water. He helped Dylan out, and they sat on a log near the shore as he unraveled the fishing line from the boy's head, arms, life jacket, and pole. After he was freed, Grandpa sat down next to him on the log, and they stared out across the water for a few long minutes. Dylan could feel it coming. The last few days had given him the experience to know when his grandfather was going to tell him a story. There were always a few moments of silence, like he was clearing his head or setting the mood. "Did I ever tell you about the monster that lives in this lake?" he asked. He had a way of asking a question without really wanting an answer. "Grandpa," Dylan said in a way that suggested he wasn't interested. "No, I know you don't like stories," the old man replied. "You've made that clear, but this one is different." "How is it different?" Dylan asked, doubt tinting his voice like Kool-Aid in a pitcher of water. "'Cause those other ones your grandma and I made up. There was a hint of truth in them, of course. There really did used to be a trapper village named Toussaint. And sure, turkeys live up here, but the rest of it we made up. Same with the demon deer and the spirit bear. Nuggets of truth, but those were just stories." "And this isn't a story?" "Oh, it is. It's more of a legend," Grandpa explained. "You see, while those other ones had a little bit of truth in them, this one is more true than not. It's a legend that just won't die up here in the woods. So it's a popular story. That's what makes it different?" "No," said Grandpa. He unbuttoned the right sleeve on his shirt and began to roll it up. "No, this one is different because I know it's true," he said, "and I can prove it. I've seen the red-eyed monster bass for myself, and he gave me this." The old man leaned over and showed Dylan a scar running down the top of his forearm, a white jagged line about 2 inches long. Suddenly, Dylan felt differently. Suddenly, he was interested, and for the first time that week, he found himself wanting to hear one of his grandfather's stories.